Welcome to my session on object-oriented design and programming. In my last session, I covered basics of applets from Module 5. In this session, I'll be covering event handling in Java from Module 5. So I'll be covering what is event handling, what is delegation event model, the different event classes, sources, and event listeners that are used in Java. Now, to start with, let's see what is an event. An event represents a specific action that is done on a component. For example, if you consider a button, when you click on a button, a specific action is done on button. Similarly, when you click on a button, the state of the button is changing from one state to another state, to a clicked state. So, an event also describes the change in the state of any object. Some of the examples of events are clicking or pressing a button, typing inside a text box, or clicking or dragging a mouse. There are several types of events, including those generated by a mouse. That means when you click on a mouse, an event is generated. Events are generated by the keyboard. When you type a character from a keyboard, an event is generated. Similarly, events are also generated from different graphical user interface controls, such as button, checkbox, text box, scroll bar, etc. Now, what are the packages that are required for event handling? There are three main packages which are required for event handling: java.util, java.awt package, java.awt.event package. Delegation event model. Java uses delegation event model for handling events. So it is a modern approach to handling events is based on delegation event model. This model defines different mechanisms for generating and processing the events. So Java uses delegation event model for handling events. In a delegation event model, a source generates an event and sends it to one or more listeners. The listeners simply wait until it receives an event. Once an event is received, the listener processes the event. So, this is how a delegation event model works. So, the source is the person who is generating the event. Every source has got a listener registered to it, and the listener it is notified whenever an event occurs. So once the event is received by the listener will process the event. A listener is an interface that listens to an event that comes from a component. Now, listener is a new term. Now, what is a listener? It is an interface that listens to the event which comes from a component. The listener must also register with a source to receive an event. How is the listener receiving the notification from the source? It must be registered with the listener. The source must be registered with the listener. So source will send the notification to those listeners which are registered to it. So this is a diagram for delegation event model. So when an event is generated on a component, it is sent to the listener. The listener will hand over the event to appropriate method that handles the event. So the source is generating the event and the event is transferred to the listener. The listener has got a number of methods. The methods corresponding to the particular event will be executed. So this is how the delegation event model works. Now let's see what is an event with respect to delegation event model. In delegation event model, an event is an object that describes a state change in a source. It can be generated as a consequence of a person who's interacting with GUI elements. Some of the activities that cause events are, for example, pressing a button, or you're entering a character from a keyboard, or you're selecting an item from a list, or you're clicking on a mouse. So these are the activities which might generate an event. The next term is event source. What do you mean by an event source? A source is an object that generates an event. This occurs when the internal state of an object changes. For example, a button. When you click on a button, it is generating an event. So, button is an event source. A source must register with listener. Another important point of a source is it must register listener in order for the listener to receive notifications about a specific type of event. Now, how do you register a source with a listener? For that, we have a method called as add type listener. So add type listener is used for registering a source with a listener, where type indicates the name of the event and EL indicates the reference to the event listener. So using add type listener method, which accepts a type listener parameter, using this method, you will register the listener to the source. For example, you want to register keyboard event, then we'll use the method add key listener. Okay, and the type listener there is key listener. Similarly, if you want to register a mouse motion listener, then you will use add mouse motion listener. So add type listener is a general syntax that is used for registering any type of listener. So where type can be replaced by key listener or mouse listener, mouse motion listener, etc. Now, when an event occurs, all the registered listeners are notified. Okay. So when an event occurs, it will check what are the listeners that are registered to the source, and all the registered listeners will be notified about the event. This process is called as multicasting the event. Now, to register only one listener, if you want to register only one listener, then what is the syntax? You can use the add type listener method, which throws java.util. Too many listeners exception. Now, some sources may allow only one listener to register. So, in that case, you can register the listener in this way. This is throwing an exception if you try to register more than one listener. So it's giving you a restriction to register only a single listener. Now this process is also known as unique casting the event. That is, when an event occurs, only the registered listener is notified. That is, only the single listener that is registered will be notified. And this process is called as unicasting the event. Now, there is another option to unregister the listener from the source. To unregister, what will we do? We'll use the method remove type listener. So remove type listener. So if you have added key listener, then to remove the key listener, we'll use the method remove key listener el. Okay. To remove a keyboard listener, we'll use the method remove key listener kl. Okay. So in this remove type listener. Type is nothing but the name of the event. Now, what is an event listener? It is an object that is notified when an event occurs. So, a listener is nothing but something which is registered with a source, and it is an object that will be notified when the source generates an event. There are two requirements for listeners. The first one is it must be registered with one or more sources to receive notification. So it must be registered with the different sources to receive the notification. Second is it must implement method to receive and process the notification. First is it must be registered with the source to receive the notification. Second is when it receives the notification, it must be able to process the events. For that, it must implement different methods to receive and process the notifications. And these listeners are nothing but the interfaces which are defined in java.awt.event package. Now let's see what are the different event classes that are present in Java for handling the events. So event classes are classes that represent event to that is for a particular event. So whenever a particular event occurs, there is a corresponding event class with respect to it. Okay, so for every event, there is a event class defined in Java. So event classes are classes that represent event. The root of the Java event class is event object, which is present in java.util package. And event object is the superclass of all the events. It defines two methods. One is the getSource method, the other is toString method. Now, event object defines two methods. The first one is getSource method, which returns the source of the event. ToString method returns the string equivalent of the event. There is another method in event which is called as AWT event. Now this is defined in java.awt package. AWT event is a subclass of event object. Event object is superclass of all the events. AWT event is the superclass of all AWT events. So that is the difference. AWT event is the child class of event object. Event object is the superclass of all events, and AWT event is superclass of AWT events. Now let's see what are the main event classes that are defined in java.awt.event package. Let's see what are the main classes. The first one is action event. So action event is an event which is generated when a button is pressed or you select an item from a menu or a list item is double clicked. When you perform all these actions, the corresponding event that is generated is action event. Adjustment event is generated when a scroll bar is manipulated, when you're trying to scroll the scroll bar up or down. Similarly, you have component event, container event, focus event, input event, item event. An item event is generated when a checkbox or a list item is clicked. When you are making a selection from a list, an item event is generated. A key event is generated when you receive an input from a keyboard, when you enter a character from a keyboard. A mouse event is generated when you drag a mouse or click a mouse, move a mouse, etc. So, mouse wheel event is generated when the mouse wheel is moved. Similarly, a text event is generated when the value of a text area or text field is changed. So, when you are when you already have some value in a text field and you are changing it, editing the value, then a text event is generated. Or you have a blank text box, you are entering something in the text box, a text event is generated. A window event is associated with a window. When the window is active, or when you close the window, or when you open or quit the window, all the events relate to window are related to window event. So main events you must know from this list is action event, item event, key event, mouse event, text event, and window event. Now let's see what are the different event listener interfaces. Okay, corresponding to each event, there will be a listener interface also. So, what do you mean by event listeners? Event listeners are interfaces that are responsible for handling the events. So, these event listeners, they'll receive the events and they are responsible for processing the events. So, these are the interfaces that are responsible to handle events. These interfaces are defined in java.awt.event package. So to create a listener, one or more interfaces are implemented in the program. So you have to implement these interfaces, these listeners in your program, and then you have to define the methods for these listeners. So when an event occurs, the corresponding method defined by the listener will be invoked. Now these are the list of listeners which are present in java.awt.event package. So the important listeners are action listener, key listener, item listener, mouse listener, text listener, window listener. So corresponding to each event, there is a listener which is defined, right? So the each event source will send the notification to these listeners. So when you're dealing with action event, what was action event? Action event is generated when a button is pressed or you select an item from a menu. So when you select an item from a menu, a notification will be sent to action listener. So you have to register action listener in your program. So action listener defines the different methods to receive the action event. So action listener is an interface which you have to implement it in your program. And action listener contains different methods to receive action events. It is used for receiving the action event and it will process the action event. Similarly, item listener defines method to recognize when the state of an item changes. So when you select an item from an item list, what happens? Item event is generated and a notification will be sent to item listener. So the corresponding method inside the item listener will be executed to handle that event. Similarly, you have mouse listener which defines 5 methods. So mouse listener is another interface which is related to mouse event. So it contains 5 different methods associated with clicking the mouse, entering and when you are entering a component using the mouse cursor, exiting from a component, or when a mouse is clicked or released, there are 5 different methods for recognizing different operations performed by the mouse. So the mouse events will be handled by mouse listener because mouse listener has got the implementation for the different mouse events. Similarly, you have mouse motion listener, which defines 2 methods to recognize when the mouse is dragged or moved. Text listener defines 1 method to recognize when a text value changes. So whenever a text event occurs, text listener will be notified. So whenever you're changing the value in a text box, text event occurs. A notification will be sent to text listener. And The method inside the text listener will be then executed to handle the text event. Similarly, window listener defines 7 methods to recognize when a window is activated, closed, deactivated, de-iconified, iconified, opened, or quit. So go through this list of event listeners. Now let's see what are the sources of events. The different sources of events are button, checkbox, choice, list, menu item, scroll bar, text components, and window. So these are the sources from which an event is generated. So button, what type of event a button generates? A button generates action event. Whenever you click on a checkbox, it generates item event. So whenever you move a scroll bar, it generates adjustment event. Whenever you click on a window, suppose if you are clicking on a close button inside a window event is generated. So these are different GUI components which are generating the corresponding events. So button generates action event. Checkbox generates item event. Choice generates item event. List again generates item event. Action event. Menu item generates action event. So generates action event. List generates action event when an item is double clicked, or generates item event when an item is selected. So list is nothing but like a drop down menu where you have a list of items and you select an item. So it generates an action event. Menu item generates action event. Scroll bar generates adjustment event. Text components generate text events. Similarly, window is a source which it generates window events. So that's all in this session. So in this session, I've covered what is event handling, what is an event, what is delegation event model, what are different classes, event sources, and listeners used in Java, which is used for handling events. In my next session, I'll be dealing with handling keyboard events, mouse events, and action events. Thank you.